Next, Commissioners, we're going to do a public meeting item number 1, and that's an application for a certificate of appropriateness in the Borough of Manhattan, docket number 16-1604, block 1496, lot 41, 1010 Park Avenue, also known as 1010 to 1012 Park Avenue, in the Park Avenue Historic District. An annex to a Gothic Revival style church designed by Merrill and Holmgren and built in 1960. The application is to demolish the building and construct a new building. And this was heard. Okay. This was heard in October. Heard October 21st.
Can you wait for 1 second?
Hold on just 1 second.
They can set it.
Oh, did you set it up?
Good morning,
Yes.
Commissioners. William Neely with the Preservation Department staff. Again, this application is for the demolition of an existing 1960s annex here, which incorporates some portion of historic stonework, and to construct a new residential apartment building. You saw this on October 21st. You had some questions for the applicant and asked them to, in addition to responding to the public testimony, to respond with additional information and clarification on some specific points the commissioners raised around the table. So they are back today with a supplemental presentation. You have a copy of that, a copy of the original handout, and I will turn it over to the project team.
Thank you, Bill. We'll reopen the hearing.
This is advanced.
It's not me. It's you. Thank you, Bill. Chair Srinivasan, Commissioners, I'm Paul Selver, member of the firm of Kramer 11 F. Allison Frankel, to counsel to the Park Avenue Christian Church. I'm here today with representatives of the church, with Buyer Blinder Bell, the architect for the proposed building, with representatives of Extell Development Corp., and with my colleague Valerie Campbell. Unfortunately, Pastor Jackson was called away on a family emergency and could not join us, and he sends his regrets about being unable to participate. I'd like to introduce the church's presentation with a few remarks that I trust will provide a framework for consideration of the information that will be presented today. My starting point is the standard for approval of a certificate of appropriateness. That is, whether the changes to the annex site proposed in this application, and that is replacing the existing 1960s building with a new building containing function space for the church as well as apartments, are, quote, appropriate for and consistent with the purposes of the landmark. Okay. The test of whether a change is appropriate is required to be considered in two contexts. The first is the building or site being altered, in this case, the annex building itself. The second is the neighboring buildings, in this case, principally the sanctuary and 1000 Park Avenue, but including more generally the other apartment buildings that were developed along Park Avenue between the 19-teens and the 1960s, and which form the basis of the designation of this district. The annex itself is not a unified composition. It is a pastiche, an 18-inch deep gable from the original construction, and a 6-story building from the 1960s that is an undistinguished brick box dressed up with some Gothic details at its base. Its current condition does not reflect, either wholly or in substantial part, the original intent of the church's architect, the original composition of the 3 buildings around a courtyard, the original materials, or the original lot coverage, scale, or massing. It is a building form driven by the functional and financial needs and limitations of the church in the early 1960s. The annex is sited in a mid-block location between 1000 Park Avenue, one of the scores of palazzo-type apartment buildings that give the historic district its distinctive character, and the sanctuary, one of the institutional buildings that punctuates the avenue's mid-rise street wall with its own low-rise street wall. Yet taken as a whole, the annex does not relate to or acknowledge either of these buildings. Its street wall is neither the low street wall designed by Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson, nor the straightforward, simple 150-foot street wall of the apartment buildings. Rather, and unlike other churches within the district, including the nearby St. Ignatius Loyola, it rises in steps, first from the sidewalk to a height of about 40 feet, then setting back about 22 feet, then rising further to a height of about 65 feet. Again, this height is something that was born of function and the financial capacity and limitations of the church. It was not born out of a conscious deference to either the height of the no longer extant parish house. Given the condition of the annex and its relationship to its neighbors, we believe, and Buyer Blinder Bell will explain why, the effects of the proposed replacement of the annex with a new building are appropriate in the context of both its site and its neighbors. We acknowledge that the Commission found that the annex has some isolated features that are historic and others that are special. The former are historic in the sense that they date either from the construction of the original parish house or the complete replacement of the parish house by the annex. The latter are special in the sense that they are unusual. However, the building needs more than a few historic or special features to possess a style. A style requires the integration of these features into a unified whole to which these features contribute, and that did not happen here. The building features of the original fragment reflect its initial construction, but do not relate to the entirety of the building as it is today. The stone and mortar colors of the lower facade of the 1960s construction do not match that of either the gable or the sanctuary, and as we pointed out, the brick box that sits above these facades reflects function. It defers neither to the original site plan nor to the materials and massing of the former parish house. The fact that the Commission determined that the annex is a no-style building in the face of the findings that it had certain historic or special features reflects, we believe, an understanding of the difference between the existence of features that might distinguish one building from others in the historic district and the combination and composition of features sufficient to give a building a style. With this background, we believe that it's clear that the proposed application does not affect, change, or destroy the exterior architectural features of the annex. That is, its architectural style, design, and general arrangement, and the components of its exterior. The most compelling reason is that the Commission has already determined that the building is lacking in this style. The first and most important of the four linked criteria of an exterior architectural feature. The second is that the features of the building identified by the Commission as historic or special are not collectively sufficient to give the building the coherence needed to establish any of them as an exterior architectural feature within the meaning of the landmarks law. The proposed replacement will also be a more appropriate neighbor than the annex is today. The massing of the annex does not acknowledge or reflect the characteristics that led the Commission to designate the historic district. More particularly, it is not consistent with the height and massing of the apartment buildings that line the avenue, nor is it consistent with the unified visual character of the district's institutional buildings that provide periodic breaks in that apartment building street wall. The current annex has a stepped form and an arbitrary building height relates to neither of these characteristics. The proposed building will resolve these ambiguities inherent in the design of the current annex. It will declare itself to be a modern interpretation of the classic Park Avenue apartment house. Its materials and character will reflect its location in the middle of a block. It will defer to the sanctuary by providing a backdrop for the sanctuary consistent with the character and design of other buildings adjacent to churches, including those within this and other historic districts. And it will defer to 1000 Park Avenue by matching its 150-foot cornice line, by incorporating design features that design the building's base and top of its street wall, and by providing a deliberately modest lobby entrance, among other things. Finally, we respectfully submit that the approval of this proposal will advance the purposes of the landmarks law. The law is not about freezing development, nor is it about saving buildings or fragments that do not merit protection. It is about ensuring that within each historic district, those buildings or features which help give the district a sense of place are preserved and that new development enhances that sense of place. Here, we are proposing to replace a building which the Commission has determined does not have a style and therefore, almost by definition, cannot contribute to a district's sense of place. Preserving this building does not advance the purposes of the law, but in fact misuses the law to freeze the evolution of the historic district and prevent its evolution into a living, breathing 21st century neighborhood. We believe, and Jack Beyer will now explain, that the proposed building will provide the kind of thoughtful evolutionary renewal that will keep the district a vital and distinctive place for generations to come. Thank you. Jack.
Thank you. Yes.
Michael Whetstone is here to help me with my presentation to you about what we have done since we saw you last. We listened to the community, we listened to you, we spoke to the staff, and came up with 7 points, which we'll go through quickly, to describe our reaction to what we heard. What you're seeing today is not a proposal, it's our reaction to your and the community's comments. One would then presume after your deliberations, we would have some direction from you as to moving in the next step. Paul certainly gave an adequate presentation in many ways, including the setting for the building. The only thing we want to stress is the significant relationship, not only between the annex and the church, but between our neighbors, the post-war building 1000 Park Avenue, the pre-war building 1000 Park Avenue, the post-war building 1020, representing characteristic buildings in the entire Park Avenue district. So the first thing I want to do is quickly remind you, let's go to the next series of slides. The setting, as stated, is that we have the church, 1000 Park Avenue to the south. The remaining fragment of the original building, the only piece of the original building, the reconstruction in a stone somewhat like the original stone, but a completely new fenestration of the annex itself. The building behind it, which is a tan brick building, and then the church. The interior features of the church you know well. As you know, when we had the building, the original building replaced in 1963, there was created a light well between the two buildings. This is, again, the issue of what was original, and should that have been retained, we wouldn't be here today. That was a significant aggregation of a church and its annex and its rectory. But what we have instead, shown in tan, is the remnant that is the only original piece, and the rest is new. So the topic number one is the height of the building. Now as I walk through this with you, you should go through your books because there's a 2-page spread on your books, and you can see a little bit more as we move along, so you can go back and forth between my presentation and the actual larger scope that's shown in the 2-page spread. The key point about the elevations that were sketched here in a photo montage is that there is a significant variety of buildings. This is our site, 85th Street, Park Avenue, 1000 Park Avenue, 1200 Park Avenue, the church, St. Ignatius, Loyola, etc. That the number of buildings that we have along Park Avenue, and look at both sides of the page, we have situations where mid-block conditions exist, where tall buildings do exist, and it's singularly unique to have taller buildings in the mid-block. We also want to point out the fact that most blocks are at least one or two buildings turning the corner, with very few side lot line buildings visible, except where you have a special condition such as what we have today at our site. Moving along, we have a view here of post-war buildings on Park Avenue in the district, pre-war buildings, both indicating that both pre-war and post-war have a fair number of buildings with setbacks that continue the height above the typical 14th floor cornice line. It is not just the new buildings, the post-war buildings that have that. Many pre-war buildings have that condition. And as you see, as we move into the Upper East Side Historic District on Park Avenue, we find the same considerations. Next. This is an elevation looking west on Park Avenue. This is 85th Street, 84th Street, 100 Park Avenue, our proposed buildings, the church, and 1200 Park Avenue, illustrating the fact that the original cornice line that we see so often in Park Avenue was often altered, either with an addition with the original building or with an addition that came later, some even 2 stories, and that the height of our building is essentially a mediation between the pre-war buildings and the post-war buildings, which went considerably higher. Our setback at the 14th floor is at the 150 feet. The maximum allowable height is 210 feet, which many of the post-war buildings have. Our height is considerably below that. With regard to the relationship of the church to the building and the comment about the sidewall, there are many examples all over New York, and many of them in this district and in the Upper East Side, where churches or synagogues are next to an apartment building tower, which has a finished design return facade, so that our proposal for doing that has significant precedence. Next. This occurs in other locations in New York, St. Thomas being a memorable one, Trinity Church downtown another, little church around the corner, and a church on the Upper West Side, all illustrating that a close proximity of the church to a tower and a finished facade is not unusual. Next. Topic number 2. the design of that north facade. There were comments made that this facade might be too primary on its return along in the east-west direction, that it's best to have a primary facade on Park Avenue and a secondary facade returning, which we listened to, although we don't agree with. We studied that, and we proposed here that there could be a simplification of this facade. This is our revised version of what you saw last time, where we would reduce the flourishes and the aspect of shadow casting elements and changes of materials at the top of the building to make it more recessive and to make it less prominent. Although, keeping in mind what we just showed you, it seems to us that the return facade on in this location should be a well-designed primary facade. Next. This is a view from the north, looking southwest of the building ensemble as it is today. And this is our relationship of our proposed building with the setback at 150 feet, with the addition of the two floors, 15 and 16, fitting into what is essentially a classic Park Avenue street wall situation with a setback at the 14th floor. We find that this slide particularly telling with regard to the finishing of that facade and the continuity of the street wall. Topic number 3 is the central, most key issue of this entire proposal. It comes from the issue of the commission not designating the fragment, calling it a no-style building, and permitting the design of a new building. Next. This is an illustration of what we are not proposing, but illustrating a version of what was discussed at the commission, by the commissioners and by the public, of what could be an alternative to what we just saw as our proposal. We decided that the only place that we could really create a separation between an existing annex and a new tower that would make any sense at all would be at the point where the roof line breaks, which is 20 feet. That break would set the building, the tower, back 20 feet. The only tower on Park Avenue that would be that way, no others exist. No others are permitted under the current special zoning district. You're not permitted to set that on Park Avenue. So if this project went ahead, this would be a special permit, Euler 74711, application by Landmarks to the Planning Commission to change its, to permit a variance. We feel that the ambiguity that's created by the setback relative to the Park Avenue street wall is significant. It creates an aberration, really, in terms of the purpose of the whole scenographic quality of street wall for Park Avenue, the continuity of the facade from top to bottom, from 14th floor down, being at the property. And this is illustrating how that would look. Next. In order to make this plan work, however, and to make a residential building, which is proposed here compared to the existing conditions here, is that we would have to significantly enlarge and create windows to make the residential apartments behind this fragment workable for residential units. In other words, the small windows and no windows in the roof attic would render 1, 2, 3, or 4, 3 floors unusable, because you must have legal windows to have apartment layouts matching the size of the rooms and the apartments. So although this is not a specific design, it's an indication that there would be modifications necessary for what remains to make the building functional. Next. So that's the key issue. Keep that in mind as we move along. Topic 4 is views of the church from the south. We know that the original building and the building that exists as the annex covered up a significant portion of the stonework of the church, and no windows of the church were or are visible from the south. This annex is shown here in section. Doesn't permit any windows, so you can't see these windows today, nor could you in this location, even in the original design. What you're seeing is a blind window and the return of stone. And so, next. So this is a view, perspective view, of what's there today. And if we were to set the building back 20 feet, incidentally, the existing addition behind the fragment is set back 22 feet 6 inches. We're setting our building back, I don't even want to call it our building, this idea of a building back 20 feet because it's the right location for it. And it illustrates what you would be seeing on the side return stonework prepared with what's there. You're seeing some of the stone and some of the roof. Next. And this is a view even further back, illustrating today, and if you set the building back, what it would be in the future. Compared to what we're proposing, which is definitely of not having as much visibility of the side stonework of the church or of the roof, but we believe that there's so little architectural interest in what's there that we don't believe it's a significant loss of what would be a primary architectural articulation. And this is another view further away, and you can see the slot that we have between the new building and the church permits at least the relationship of the two to have some space and dimension. Next. This is a diagram we did. It's a little, I don't want to call it arbitrary, but it's being on the ground and walking around the entire neighborhood looking at the spire. The idea here is we have charted what you would see, and the photographs on your book on the right side of this diagram have numbers that illustrate what you see from each one of these viewpoints. Simply to try to kind of systematize or to be specific about what you do see. And walking around the building, you can see there's 3 characteristic views. The dark blue is where the spire is visible against the sky. The lighter blue is where the spire is partially visible against the sky. And the red tone is really red in the book, it's sort of a brown tone here, where the spire is visible against a building in the background. So if you walk around, you can see each one, the spire partially visible, fully visible, fully visible, fully visible, and then there's a building in the background here, and then looking down from the other side, number 8. We then charted the same diagram with the new building, as proposed, not the setback building, but as proposed. And the key thing here is what you don't see. And there is this area, which you can see the spire from today, you can't see it in our proposal. It represents 13.4% of the total area of all these views, if that's one way to describe it. And then there's more refinement of these other views. But the key thing is that percentage of what you see today is lost with our proposal, 13.4%. Next. Topic 5 is about light into the windows on the south facade of the church. Remember that this original courtyard in plan shown here was designed and permitted to provide light directly into the sanctuary with a large open space, permitting sunlight casting shadows inside the church in its original design. Today, that was for 52 years that has been gone. And what we have is this little courtyard, this light well, which exists today, which is here. And in general, the church is much more dimly lighted. You're getting absolutely, almost no sun. You get very, very rarely do you get sun except at the height of the summer. Incidentally, we did a sunlight study. Michael Kortler, who is a professional architect doing studies such as this, did a study. And next. And I'll describe that. Let me just go through a few more things, then I'll describe the results of the study. This is the view of what we have today. This area is the area of a light well that comes down to the ground, down to the first floor, which we are proposing to cover with a skylight. The amount of light coming into here is greatly constrained relative to what it was originally, and obviously our building being taller cuts off light also. This is illustrating, and you've seen it previously in our books, the relationship of the church to the existing annex to be removed in these four illustrations. The important thing really is that this line is the area of the church that we are proposing to remove to make way for this. The front portion of it is to make way for our proposal. We are creating a light well, that next slide, that permits light to come in through a skylight compared to what's there today. But what's significant in our judgment is that we are creating a significantly more open area, which is currently occupied by a full depth structure to the lot line, blocking the views of the apse. Our open area is set back because of the 33-foot rear yard that we have, permitting light to come in and sunlight to come in a much more significant way than it does today. Which is to say that we are providing, we believe, a better light source to the apse, and that what we are losing here is, we figure, is offset by what we're gaining here. So we don't think we have a significant loss of light to the overall number of windows in the church. Next. Item 6 is only 7, so we're next to last. Fenestration at the new building. There was concern that the windows were too big. We want you to just visualize just two things. One, we are really between a fabulous Emery Roth classic pre-war apartment building with windows that have a vertical proportion, and to our north neighbor across the street, 1020 Park Avenue, a post-war building that didn't care about that and have windows that are long in the horizontal direction. Our windows mediate between the smaller pre-war windows and what are out-of-scale post-war built windows, and we have windows that are the same proportion. If you draw a diagonal across a window, our windows are the same proportion as the pre-war buildings, but bigger. Why? Because it's a modern building, it's a contemporary building. Why repeat the small windows of history? That's not our goal. It turns out that in terms of the percentage of glass, the pre-war buildings this building has 30% glass. Our building has 40% glass, and this building has 50% glass. So we didn't design it that way, but it turns out that we're sort of in between, and we are strong advocates of contemporary architecture in historic settings. And we believe that this is the way this building should go if it is able to be approved. This is a raking view from the sidewalk that I think really tells the story about how appropriate this facade is in the three-dimensional scenographic quality of Park Avenue, walking up and down the sidewalks. You see things in perspective, and how it does contrast with the very big windows of the post-war buildings, but fits in our judgment, not only in the terms of the scale of the window, but the pilasters and the vertical shadow casting elements of our neighborhood. Next. This is a side elevation illustrating the finished facade. Also, keep in mind that we have other historic, valuable neighbors, all of whom have limestone, many of whom have limestone facades. And I just want you to recognize the purposeful way by which the top of our building relates to the Regis School. Lastly, the ADA access on 85th Street. We have shown a new door, and we were asked to look at other locations. And this is a plan of the ground floor that illustrates our proposal, which is to come in here, negotiate a 4-foot change in grade with a stair and a handicap lift, and enter the church as everybody else does, from the front door and finding your way into the sanctuary. We have 3 alternatives that we've looked at. One is to create a ramp that would go along the side of the building, but because it would have to be handicapped accessible, it's fairly long, and it would require the modification to the porch stoop and be in the sidewalk, requiring DOT approval, and I would think perhaps maybe problematic as an approval. The second alternative is to have people go all the way to the end of the church, the back of the church, over 100 feet away from the front door, into an existing door, into behind the altar, off limits kind of spaces for the clergy, and then up a handicap lift into what is a baptistry, which would have to be redesigned and reconfigured, and still being sort of in the front of the church. The third alternative, which was raised as an idea by many many of the community representatives, would be to use the new entrance, which also would require negotiation of a lift, but we do have the elevator in this location and the stair in this location, so that you would come in and negotiate the grade change and come into the sanctuary in an awkward position, but in this location. And the problem with all of the alternatives is that the ADA person, or the handicapped person, doesn't get equal opportunity to come into the church like everybody else does. The spirit of the ADA regulations and the law is to give equal access and the right relationship of entering into a building, whether it's a public building or otherwise. So with that, we conclude our response to your 7 points that we worked out with the staff. We are here to answer questions. None of this is a firm proposal. We look for guidance for you for the next steps. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack. Yes, Diana.
Yeah, I have a couple of, just 2 questions, actually. One is about...
Excuse me, I have a point of order, if I may. I realize I'm somewhat unusual, but you announced this, and correctly so, as a reopened hearing. And Mr. Silver made comments typical of a hearing, and Mr. Byer has made comments typical of a hearing. And I have to say on behalf of the public, this was not noticed as a public hearing, and we object to its continuation.
All right, thank you, Mr. Cass. We note that, but I just want to make a point that the Commission's practice, and I can't tell how far it goes, but we have public meetings and they are reopened for the applicant to make a presentation, and we do not take public testimony. So this is not unusual in any form or manner from the practice of the Commission. Mark, do you want to add to that? Yes.
No, this is the standard protocol for the commission. At a public meeting, a subsequent public meeting, applicants respond to public comment and to comment by the commissioners. And the hearing is opened solely for that purpose, as Steve, you're well aware.
Thank you. I appreciate your responding, but I must say that you correctly announced this was a reopened public hearing. Mr. Selden's comments were precise.
Steve, she did not say it's a reopened public hearing. She reopened the public hearing for the purpose of allowing the applicant to speak, as you know. Okay, it's no different from City Planning Commission or other bodies that open to allow applicants to respond in a format that does not mean it's open to the public, as you know.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Please note our objection. We do think it's a serious issue here. The comments may be used as a republic.
All right, Mr. Cass, if you want to submit anything in writing to us, we could enter it into the record.
Thank you very much.
Okay, back to...
Okay.
Still trying.
Sorry you interrupted us,
Okay,
but
thank you.
yes, Diana, please go ahead.
Yes. Looking at the setback scheme, as you called it, I wondered if, without considering redoing the facade or the fragment or so forth, I understood the issue of if you go into a setback of 20 feet, you would have difficulties with regard to zoning, that, and not being a zoning expert. What I wanted to ask is was there a way to have some setback that would perhaps give more respect to the adjacent church, forgetting the fragment? If you continued with your modern building, could there have been some type of setback, perhaps even at some point next to the church, that would give the church a little more breathing room, that would not entail a serious zoning issue? I'm asking you a very general question.
I just want to, I think, Dana, your question is actually very relevant, and I think that's something that you should explore And knowing the zoning and just speaking generally, the Park Avenue Improvement District, I think, was put in place perhaps in the 70s. I think there was a very, very strong policy, given the existing context, that these buildings, new buildings, should be at the street wall and for the entire length and go to a height of 150 feet. I think the historic district recognizes the predominant pattern of apartment buildings, which has always been at the street wall. However, the zoning does allow for certain undulations in the facades, including recesses. And I think it's something that's worth exploring, how you can use that recess to, I think, create a better transition to the church, and at the same time respect, I think, the historic district's essential character, which is really at the street wall. So it opens up the views, and I think it gives you some flexibility. I think this has a certain amount of depth with the recess, but it gives you more leeway in terms of the width of the recess, and I think that would address at least some of the concerns that were raised about how to transition this to.
If I can just follow up on that, if you don't mind scrolling back through the images of the other churches that you've showed.
Yeah.
I mean, one by one, let's go slowly through them. Is this the first in the series? I think not.
No, there's
But in
more.
all
Go
cases,
backwards. Okay, yeah.
there is,
Yeah.
sure, in all cases, the new buildings are some distance away from the churches, and they vary, but they give the space, the sort of the space around the church, some dimension. Even in this one, in the St. Thomas case, where there is direct adjacency, it's set back from that face because of the lower height of that base element. So, I mean, just go through them one by one and imagine if the new construction was just right up against the pier of the church, it would look like what you're proposing. So to Diana's point, I mean, the question of this kind of the space around, and I realize that you've got a limited width for the facade of your building, so the only possibility is the setback rather than the move over, the kind of the making it narrower. And the case for, in all of these churches makes the point.
Right. I think that if you can use that zoning provision creatively, you may be able to actually address that. And just going back to the issue of the fragment and the retention of the fragment, besides that there may be practical issues of including or increasing the amount of glazing and to bring in more light and air, which I think in some ways actually ruins it. And I have my own concerns about that, but I think the idea of this 20-foot setback, at least for me, I think creates a real dissonance in the street wall.
Yeah.
And I think at the cost of retaining that, actually, the historic fragment's only a very small portion of it, I think you lose on the other end of...
So what are you proposing, 5 feet of a setback?
I think, my understanding is that the setback in the zoning allows you a depth of about 6 feet. But, is that correct? I think 6 feet. And I think that in terms of the width, there's more flexibility in terms of how much you can do. So you can only go to a depth of 6 feet, but the width of that recess can vary up to, I believe, 50% of the width of the street wall.
Okay, I'm having a hard time visualizing it. Do you mind if we go to the proposal that's not a proposal?
That may be hard to see on the, yeah. There we go.
And if you go to, I think maybe, do you have another angle? Because I think what that may show, because the issue is...
Page 27 and 29.
Actually, it's the issue where you're looking towards the church, so it'll be able to, maybe you don't have that, but...
27 and 29, I think, are the two.
It means that the building face will come out further, but not at the street line.
So that's the 6 feet.
So it seems like it may actually expose that column at the end of the edge of the church. And then the recess itself, in terms of the width, is variable and can work within, within I think the patterns of fenestration to work in a reasonable manner. But I think that may be able to address it.
Until I looked at pages 27 and 29 in these renditions of the proposal, the existing, the proposal that's not a proposal, and the actual proposal, I don't think I quite understood what my issue was with the facade. And I understand that that you say there's no detail that's lost, but it's the dimensionality of the building. I think that's a word that that Adi used. By setting it back, even that small amount, you retain the sort of three-dimensional view of the building. If you look at page 29, that's what's missing on that in the proposal.
Right. I mean, I think one of the things to consider is that right now you don't have it exposed, and
well, that's exactly
right.
what it brought up, was when you look at page 27, where you see the existing, you actually do see it.
Yeah.
All right, and that's the angle that
let me see which one.
that interests me the most.
John, which
Page 27, which is the one page that's up there, right?
Oh,
No, that's not it. One before, yeah, that one. See, existing on the left, where you do get that three-dimensionality of the building, all right? And then in the proposal that's not a proposal, you also get that three-dimensionality.
You can sort of see it in the 29 also, where they have their
Right.
building.
In 29
the
you
same
see
issue,
it.
yeah, because it contrasts
Right.
Right.
coming all the way out to the street wall.
Right, and I think, just in the zoning will probably have
Yeah.
some limitations which may not let you do the full extent, but I think it's worth for them to explore that, yes.
Would this require a ULURP and rezoning, or could you just do this as a variance?
That's
A
what-
variance, having been at the Board of
Right.
Standards and Appeals, I think the case for a variance is a set of findings which is a little more complicated from 74-711. I don't know if the applicants want to explore that, but it's really based on economic hardship. So the considerations of the building's massing vis-à-vis landmarks and our ability to support a project, I think, are not really considerations for a variance per se. So they'd have to find some other reason, but I don't even know they'd have to basically come up with a case. But just on the basis that the commission thinks that the massing of the building with some variation to the zoning is the basis for a variance, it's a very hard case to make.
Cool.
But I think it's something that they should both, yeah.
So what we're saying is that it's still critical that they retain that the Rectory 60s original facade be retained?
No.
Yes?
I don't,
None of it?
I don't know if we're saying anything yet.
No.
Well, I think we're just.
I'm asking
we're-
to clarify
I
what
think
the chair is
we're
saying.
commenting right now, and we're sort of
Yeah.
discussing that. And I just want to comment that I think that retaining the facade, first of all, I'm not sure I can support or require them, in order to make an appropriateness case, the retention of part of that portion or the entire portion. I think that you can make a case for appropriateness even if you remove what we, as a commission, has determined is a no-style building.
Yeah, my question specifically was saying if you didn't retain the fragment, but you tried to address a setback in some fashion to give the church itself more breathing room.
I see.
That's what I was asking. Because we're looking at a non-proposal that showed the fragment being retained. I was saying if the fragment was not retained,
Which would mean that there's the strongest case that they've made, the architects have made about the facade of the new building being at the same aligned with the other buildings
Right.
is one that we would be undermining by asking for it to be set back at some amount, right? Because, I mean, so that means that we don't support the argument as being the dominant one, that the new building needs to be at the face of the other buildings on Park Avenue.
See, I think that it's To me, since we're having this discussion, I think that there's an incredible loss if, in fact, we have a building that sets back for its entirety and does not provide the street wall, because I think
But that's what exists today. Is there a loss there? I mean,
Right, but we're talking about a new building here, and I think that's somewhat different from a piece of a building which the Commission has identified as no style, and therefore its relationship to the district is very different from all the other buildings. I think the Park Avenue Historic District is really about these pre-war buildings that have high street walls, and they're very, very consistent. That is the predominant character. So if they're proposing a high-rise building, then I think to meet the standard of appropriateness, given the context of the historic district, I think you want to have a street wall building. And I think the Commission is very consistent about that. I think that there are ways that the building massing may change and be massaged or are refined, but I think the general proposition of having a street wall building is, I think, very important to the district. And I think, at least in my opinion, I think the concerns about the church and the relationship of the building, the new building, is more critical than retaining the fragment. And I think it's maybe just my acknowledgement that most of that fragment is from the 1960s, and the portion that is from the earlier period is merely a facade. I looked at different sort of architectural solutions if you just even try to keep the facade. They're very, very awkward, and that could be another approach. You don't have to do the whole thing. You don't have to set it back 20 feet.
Right.
You can set it back, something that generally meets the street wall requirements.
Within the 6 foot.
Mm-hmm.
But you get a very awkward situation. And if you try to put the recess towards the apartment building, which will expose an end wall, but you'll keep at least some portion of the fragment, I think that's a worse solution than from them actually trying to transition to the church, which is going to remain and is, I think everybody would agree, is an important part of the district and has beautiful architecture.
just as a follow-up to your point about the appropriateness, and do you mind clarifying for me, was the original church built with any kind of a rectory at all? The original had a rectory with that open courtyard. So at this very same time, the church was built with rectory.
I think they have it.
Right. No, I just didn't know if those two happened at some period of time after the church was built, because the windows were obscured there too. So.
Yes, Commissioners, this building that fronted onto Park Avenue was the rectory, and this building at the back of the site was the parish house. And that's this.
There was a rendering in the first presentation that showed the
There's a-
architect's,
There's a 3D one that shows it. Is that the one? Yeah, it's, I think, on.
I was thinking there was like an aerial
Page
sketch.
8 of the original.
Okay.
That's,
The massive.
Yeah.
Original parish house, original rectory, original parish house.
So the
Yes,
original-
Diana.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Diana, and then Adi.
Yeah, I had another brief question, which was just from looking at the street wall, the presentation of all the heights of the building, it appeared to me that there were two on the west side which were taller than the proposed building, which are close to it, and then one on the east side. And I'm not sure if my just guessing at the height is correct, and I just wanted to ask Jack if that was accurate, or if there are more buildings that are at or above the height of
Yes.
the proposed building.
Yeah, I can
Thank you.
answer that. Michael Weston from Meyer Bell. So sorry, this is divided into two halves. So the upper photograph is the west side of Park Avenue. So you can see that there is on 79th Street a setback building,
with some taller floors, and there is between 85th and 86th Street, 1020 Park Avenue, which we described, and then adjacent to it, I think 1036 Park Avenue, those are tall. And then towards the upper part, there are 3 of them, 89th to 90th, several others that are taller. And then likewise on the east side of Park Avenue, there's one here. So there are, and we pictured them all separately. These are 6 buildings in the Park Avenue Historic
Yeah, I
District
heard it.
that go above the street wall up to about 210 feet and have floors of 7.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to understand. Thank you.
Okay, yes, Adi?
I have to express the fact that I wasn't here when the decision was made for the no style on this other building, and I actually don't understand the extent to which it is another building. I mean, it seems to me to belong to the campus of the church, and so, I guess that fundamentally that's an issue for me, because it seems that if there was originally a rectory built at the same time as the church itself, I understand that the fabric of that building of that part is now gone, but the unit, the entirety of the campus is I guess what we're discussing today, and it. While I understand the street wall, the interest in maintaining street wall facades for new buildings, post this 1905, 1915, the volume of this corner campus I think, needs to be considered as the dominant issue here, and so I understand, and I recognize that the setbacks are awkward, both if that we maintain only a facade, or if we do as you propose, which is to create some kind of a space around the actual church piece. But losing what was once rectory and then another version of it, I think is a worse is not a preferable solution.
Right. The only thing I would say is that just to that point. About you not being here when this decision was made, and
it's hard to me understand.
I think it's sort of a general concept that the commission, that we do give some deference to the commission at whichever time that adopts things. Otherwise, every commission would keep reinventing the wheel. So I think there is some respect given to the determinations that were made by the commission at that time, and I think we have to sort of respect that. So I don't know if the applicants, would you like to respond to that question? Yes, on the issue of the campus.
I'll say something, and then Jack say something. I think it goes, Paul Selver, I think it goes to the issue of not just comedy with decisions of the prior commission, but also what historic districts and the evolution of historic districts are all about. If the original condition was there and there was something to restore, I think we might, as Jack said at the beginning, we wouldn't be here today. But the original condition isn't there. It was obliterated in the 1960s. And what you have there is something very, very different, and something that was not intended to evoke the original. It was intended to produce something that the church needed in the 1960s. And what we're doing is, we think, reasonable in the context of a building that has been so changed from its original that there's almost nothing left to restore it to, certainly not enough to hang a building on. I might also say, by the way, just in terms of the discussion about recesses, that actually I think 1020 has a 3-foot recess in the context of the street wall. So the issue of a recess and maintaining the street wall are actually can be consistent concepts.
I'm sorry, 1020, which is the
Modern
building across the street.
So if it's 50, you have up to 50% of this, as far as 6 feet back, without being ultimately destructive of the street wall.
Yes.
Michael?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of things to talk about on this.
Right, maybe, There are a lot, because they actually broke down their presentation into 7 parts, which was very helpful. But it seems that we've entered into the areas of height and massing and street wall and facade.
I mean, first of all, I want to say that I disagree with what Mr. Selver said in terms of and basically the argument was, what's there now was put there as a demonstration of disregard for the initial relationship that the architect originally created for the campus, and that because of that disregard, which he implies, sanctioned by designating it a no-style building, therefore what was there is lost in whole cloth and completely, and that there's really no substantive going, one need not look back. I think that the evidence of the structure that's there belies that. I think that certainly the 60s was not a period noted for its historic preservation efforts. Were this a solely economic decision on the part of the church at the time, they wouldn't have spent the extra $20 to save that little sliver of facade. They wouldn't have set the building back. They would have just bombed it, put up a 6-story brick box with strip windows, and called it a day. So I think the fact that the building and the church went to the effort to set the building back, to maintain the fragment of the facade, to organize its mass in such a way as to basically create the impression of the original campus while adding significant volume to serve its functional needs, indicates a desire on the part of that benighted 1960s architect to try his best within his abilities to maintain the initial design relationship between the elements of the original design, namely the church, the infill piece, and the bay window gabled element on the end. So for me, I don't think we're starting, let me talk a little bit about the style thing. I was here when we voted on that as a no-style building. And I'm speaking for myself and not as a policy matter, but my understanding of that discussion was we used this designation of style, no style, as a proxy for talking about go ahead and think about developing this, or don't even think about developing this. And I'm not sure that, and I know that we're as the commission goes forward, we've talked about trying to move away from that model and wording things in resolutions in a way that is more explicit and is less, I don't know, using one word for another purpose. I think that at that time I mentioned and others mentioned that while the overall structure, because of its vintage and mass and all that other stuff, was a no-style structure, that there were significant elements within it that had remained. So I don't think that, placing the burden of the entire project on the head of the statement, it's a no-style building, therefore carte blanche, I don't think that's a fair way to view it. And even if it were, what goes back should be appropriate to the district and to the buildings that are adjacent to it. And in this case, what you have is a building that was initially designed as a campus building in an urban setting. All right? Back when it was originally designed, it was envisioned to be surrounded by taller apartment buildings. And the creation of this quasi-bucolic country Gothic ensemble was meant to provide a contrast to the urban setting in which it found itself. So I think that the key thing for me that is problematic about the basic design is that it changes the nature of this building and this corner of the district from one where a caesura from the urban fabric was meant to take place to basically a single box chapel. And that's a significant change of the nature of this portion of the district and of this particular design, such as it is, as it remains. And that was, I think, clearly the intent, that keeping that campus quality while adding that volume was, for better or for worse, I think clearly intended, even by the 1960s design.
Right. No, I understand what you're saying. The only, the concern I have with that is I think that the designation report and how they've talked about this, at least in my opinion, doesn't seem to suggest that the campus is what we're trying to preserve here. And so the flexibility of what takes place on the site, and there are different responses to that. But I don't think that it at least signaled to me that the intent was to somehow keep the campus setting. And even if it was the case, I don't think that that is necessarily the only appropriate response for the site. So I think those are two different issues. One is, yes, you could have, in fact, they could design a site which, in fact, would probably make us all very happy if they kept similar volumes that they have right now. The question is that, for us, is that what they're proposing, is that appropriate given the decisions that this commission has made regarding this historic district? And I think we should take guidance from that, because that's what really guides us. So I think that was just my comment on that.
I think that on other matters, I think that the non-proposal is far from hellacious. I think that there's that for me, I understand the street wall imperative as being one that governs the district generally. But this is an odd case. And I think that for me, when looking at the volume of the non-proposal, what's disturbing to me is not its setback. And in the views that were presented, the montages, the same feeling was kind of reinforced for me. It was the height. I think that for me, if one imagines this thing set back, but at the cornice height, with maybe a deeper setback penthouse instead of the rising volume of this kind of Art Deco-y, very, very vertically oriented kind of expression, I think it becomes a lot less disruptive, and I think it, even though it violates that kind of urbanistic tenet, I think it kind of works here. That's not to say it's the only thing that could work here, and that's why I would want to draw our attention to the pages 8 and 9, where you see the streetscape. I think another way to look at this, instead of saying, well, let's set it back and that's the only solution, I think there's another solution. One of the key qualities of this design is what I was taught in school as the head, neck, body, right? You have a skinny, tall thing, a bridge, and then a box. And that's kind of the design of this church, right? It had a skinny, tall thing, a stretcher, and then a box. You could keep those proportions and kind of just take the skinny, tall thing and make it skinnier and taller. That could be another way of looking at this. And then I look at 1055 Park Avenue, 985 Park Avenue, 949 Park Avenue, all skinnier buildings that are approximately the width of the bay window, more or less, but that would preserve the head-neck-body relationship of this campus, of this ensemble, while allowing for a street wall building, perhaps, but just a shallower one, a narrower one. Maybe that could be combined with a setback that would allow for the street wall and allow for the retention of views of the landmark structure that were enhanced, allow for better light to the chapel, which is really not our thing to worry about, but that would allow for a kind of echo of the original design intent in a new structure that was obviously, by dint of the other guys who did it on the block, sustainable on an economic basis. I mean, I don't think there's just one way to go here, but I don't think I don't think that what's being presented for me feels particularly satisfying or
Right, but,
appropriate.
so just going back to your suggestion, so you get your street wall building because you're, can you sort of explain
Right.
that again? Because
Imagine 985 Park Avenue, 949 Park Avenue, 1055 Park Avenue. All of them are skinny buildings that are very tall and have a street wall presence, right? If this building, instead of being the full width of the site, were less,
Okay.
were narrower, such that it read perhaps as a part of the composition. Basically, what this design is saying is, you know what? We're going to change the partie of the block from being a building with a church to being two buildings with a skinnier church. And I guess what I'm saying is there's a way to do it where this building is part of the church ensemble still, but it's not it's not saying, well, there was, we're going to erase the parts of the church and change the type of church from a campus country type church to a kind of box nestled in its lot kind of format. That you could really keep that arrangement. I mean, clearly they are recognizing that they're part of the campus of the church because they're having a facade facing the church, and they're making gestures to the church through the fenestration, the pillars, the materials, which I think is appropriate. Otherwise, you'd say the building should be brick because all the rest of the buildings are brick. But the fact that the limestone is being used is meant to tie this with the church, as is the verticality. So fine. So make it narrower. Maybe make it narrow for a certain distance and then widen it if that needs to be done for layouts. But if you had a building, for instance, that was as wide, more or less, as the bay window structure, as are those other buildings, I don't see why that would not create a better ensemble with the church and also be appropriate to the street. So, imagine instead of that wide a building next to the church, that wide a building next to the church. And maybe that either went the whole way or went a portion of the way and then stepped out. But basically, it would create the street wall, but it would do so for a narrower profile. I mean, I'm not saying that that's...
Right, no, I understand, and I think there's I'm not surprised that in fact this particular building can bring out many, many comments and approaches to the site. And I think, again, I would say many of them could be considered appropriate. I think in terms of sort of articulating why this is not appropriate is sort of an interesting question. I can come up with another solution. If the idea is to... There seem to be two issues here. One is that is there a basis and an absolute necessity for appropriateness to retain somehow either the memory or the actual physicality of these buildings? All of them, meaning both portions, the historic fabric and the 60s fabric, or just part of it? So that's a question of whether that in the absence of that, can the building not meet the appropriateness standard? So that's one issue. The second is that, as I think Mr. Selver and Jack pointed out, when we look at appropriateness, are we look at appropriateness in and of itself, in its relations to its partners? And so we have a situation over here, just in the abstract, the idea of having a building that is between an apartment building and a church, in my mind, doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a lower building or a skinnier building. And I think that there are plenty of situations where you have taller buildings next to churches, and I don't necessarily think that they're not deferential. They are developed at different points in time. Here we have an opportunity, which is about seeing how best to try and make this building relate to the church. If facadism is an acceptable matter, you could incorporate this entire facade in a way without setbacks, and it tells a story. There are examples that are done in Europe, and they recall a certain kind of, they do, I think they're honest about what they're trying to do, which is they want to recall the historic fabric in a more blunt manner, which is, this is it, but here's a new building above it. I don't know if the commission has been open about that kind of incorporation of a facade. I think very often people are taking the position that they don't like that, but sometimes it may be appropriate. That will give you your street wall and will give you the retention of the fabric. The treatment of the base and keeping a portion of the facade, and the other being more in terms of material can talk about the 60s, and that can form a connection too. So I think that for us, it seems, as a commission, if we feel that we want the history of this campus, leaving aside what happens behind, somehow incorporated to make the appropriateness standard, then that's the direction that they have to take back. And they can try and look at a more as-of-right solution to try to incorporate that. But I think from that side perspective, we have to also be a little more flexible in how we look at the incorporation of facades in situations which are different. And maybe this is overriding in that kind of incorporation of this material into the base of the building, where maybe in another case we would want to see the substantial fabric behind. We've seen a church recently where we essentially just kept the facade. It does mean a little bit of, I think, creative architecture on their part to try and meet the street wall requirements in order to do that. But there may be ways to do it. I personally think that that is not the only approach to addressing the issue of how this new building will and can be incorporated into the context of this historic district in a respectful manner, as well as give deference to the church building itself, which is the building that's really has style, is contributing, and has been recorded by the commission in its report. So I think they can come back with an alternative and show us alternatives to that. But I think it would mean that we'd be taking a leap in a different direction in terms of trying to, it really is become like just a face, and that would be it. So. All right. So, yes, any other comments on the annex?
Well,
then we can talk about some of the others.
Well, just to be clear for myself, a standard is appropriateness, and I think at least part of appropriateness is respect for the church, which is a building that we clearly care about, and respect for the neighborhood. And respect for the church, I think, I do agree with Commissioner Goldblum that part of that is the tableau that this created. And another part of it is what I mentioned earlier, which is that sort of three-dimensionality of that terrific building. If accidentally that means that they can save that facade, I think that'll make a lot of people happy, all right? Even if it's not part of my standard for appropriateness. And I think the not a proposal tells you that there are ways to do this. I don't find a small setback as inelegant as others might find it, but I think that there are ways to bring those two things together. And noting that other building is actually 1020 is 3 feet setback surprised me because it's so subtle. In any event, I think that there are ways to reach those two goals, which is to say, creating the tableau as well as saving the three-dimensionality of the building.
Yes, Diana.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on another aspect of the applicant's presentation because I also thought that the issue of the what is a side facade, which presents as a primary facade, is an important one. And I do think that trying to regularize that to some extent and make it less prominent and a little more retiring is a desirable feature. I, would support their direction, going in that direction.
Right, and I think we had commented about that and showed some distinction, and they've gone in the right direction on that. Yes, Michael.
I'm okay with, I think it's better to have, if we're trying to make this a party wall building, then it should be much simpler still. I think if it's supposed to be part of the church ensemble, it's okay that it's a finished facade.
I agree.
Right, and I think it still remains a finished facade, but it's...
But if,
Yes. Okay. Let me see what the other issues for that was. So for the north facade, any comments on just the height of the building itself and the arguments on that aspect? Yeah.
So one of
Roberta,
the
go ahead.
Last time, I think, was that I thought that the height, that it was too high considering this proximity on that block to that church. And I think that they've shown examples of other buildings, but I think that there's still something to be said for having a height that at least is not higher than the building that is beside it. I'm just looking at it for this block. I know if you do a whole study of the entire side of the street, you could make an argument for why it should be higher.
Okay, but Roberta, you're saying that this height seems like the height, and it shouldn't get higher, or...
It shouldn't get higher, it should get lower, that's what I'm saying.
Okay. Right.
And I actually wanted to also comment on the question of fragment versus no fragment. And I know that we did say it was a no-style building, but I think that the fact that it's a no-style building still doesn't mean that there's some things that can't be considered. And I think in terms of scale, in terms of proximity, in terms of materiality and relationship, and its historic fabric, but it's also its location, I think that it has to be considered as one of the proposals. The non-proposal should be a proposal, and that we should look at it. I'm not saying that the non-proposal as presented is the best case scenario for what that could be, but it, at least for me, shows me that there is a possibility, a way of doing it. And I normally do not I don't think we've ever approved anything where it's just 3 feet of the facade and 3 feet and that's it, because that does seem various. It seems phony in a way, but at the same time, I think that maybe that is the solution to several preservation issues that I see here present in this building, in this location, in this adjacent site. And so I would want to see that be one of the considerations for their return and bringing back.
I'm so sorry, Roberta.
Okay, no, that's the end. No, what I was just saying at the end is that I think that having the facade, even if it is that fragment of the building, even if it is only 3 feet, 5 feet, whatever, is still an important element in terms of resolving a preservation issue for this development on this site.
For the height, again, I think if you look at the pages 8 and 9, the streetscape, it's interesting. There are two kinds of buildings that break the line. There are the modern buildings, 1036, 1020, 920, and then there are the pre-war buildings that break the line. I think that the pre-war buildings, I think that the post-war buildings are there, but I don't think they look like they belong in the district too well. I hate to say no style, but they certainly are. They're modern style, but they're not. I don't think they're doing a great job of contributing to the district's special quality. Whereas the pre-war buildings that break the line, like 1120, 970, and I think 1095, they have a very strong horizontal at the cornice line, above which they break with their setbacks, dormers, whatever. And I think that that's a significant difference between the post-war and the pre-war buildings that bears examination. If we're going to say that it's okay to do to have the building go above, and I kind of agree with Roberta that I don't see why, it should. But if I think a better case could be made for exceeding that kind of very strong belt line, if the belt line were more emphatic. I think that the design of the buildings as having these piers that pass through their cornice and kind of create this Art Deco kind of buttress effect eviscerates that horizontal line that almost all the buildings that I would say contribute to the district, even those that exceed the height, possess. So I'd say they should, consider that.
I would agree. I think that if you look at the best examples of and the predominant examples of the historic fabric of the district, we're really talking about street walls at 125 feet, and they are articulated through cornices. And I understand the design philosophy of trying to accentuate the verticality of this building, but I think that actually, even if you want to put setbacks on top, you do it by still articulating somehow a very clear datum line that's there. And I think the other thing is that just in terms of for the applicants, there's, I think, some flexibility in doing that without, let's say, a loss of the program, because you have several, in fact, the top floors are much higher in floor-to-ceiling heights, and so I think there are areas that can actually be, or the floor-to-ceiling heights can be looked at, which would allow you to maybe even remove one of the floors off to the setback and still be able to keep your program. Okay. Other comments? Yes.
So I would disagree with your points about height. I think that if set back to accommodate the existing campus wall of the rectory parts, then the new building becomes sort of an object in and of itself, and that justifies both an exceptional height or a difference in height, which means it shouldn't and need not conform to the horizontal bands that you're referring to, and also can have this sort of full wraparound dominant facades, because it is kind of an object in and of itself rather than another element along the wall facades of Park Avenue. So.
Okay. Well, I was more sort of commenting on what their proposal is right now. But I understand, and sort of that accommodation is that what you're saying is that if you give a little on this side, somehow the height may be okay.
That was a bargain, which
right.
It actually is, it seems to me, from a design perspective.
Right. Right. Okay. All right. Any other comments?
Ramp?
The ramp, it seems, yes, the stairs and the ramp, it seems that they've shown some options, and it seems like it's a very problematic way to try and allow ADA compliance without really compromising the ability of people with disabilities to enter. I think there's no perfect solution, and when you look at what they're proposing, it's a very modest change to the facade of the building. So I think that shouldn't be the issue. So I guess in terms of, yes, Michael, you...
I'll cast a no vote on that one. I think that the ramp is a much less invasive, much more common, much more removable way of addressing it, which puts the handicapped individual in exactly the same place without having to rely on an interior lift, which often is not working. So it's both, from a handicapped accessibility point of view, better for the handicapped individual, and I think, and It's much less intrusive into the architectural fabric of the building. It doesn't.
But doesn't it
mess
cover
the-
more of the facade?
At about 3 feet off the ground, it doesn't cut a hole in the facade that's asymmetrical. That's, that you'll never be able to fix, and I think that we've seen a zillion ramps that go in front of churches, and you could do it in a perfectly lovely way that would blend with the church. You're allowed by code to go out 42 inches beyond your street wall with a ramp. It's done all the time.
Well, I think, I would say that the other two solutions are the ones which I think really do not work. The ramp, I think the door is very modest, and again, this is not an individual designation. It's a very modest thing, and I'm not sure it's a make or break issue here. I think the ramp actually just seems like it takes up more space, and I think the intervention into this building is really very modest by creating that doorway. All right, so just in terms of, I think, direction for the applicants, but I want to note that we did receive some testimony, written testimony, let me just pull it out, that we did receive a letter from the Historic Park Avenue group that obviously still has concerns about this project, and we can distribute it to you, as well as from Steve Cass, who just spoke a little while ago, that we can also distribute to the commissioners. And I think it's better if we just distribute it to all of you, because instead of me trying to paraphrase what they're saying, I think would be just better for all of you. So we can share these additional written material with the commissioners. So in terms of our comments, I don't know, there's been a lot of discussion, and I think that the commission is, so the commission is looking for some alternatives here, and I think alternatives that really try and address two broad issues, the same ones that we had identified previously, which is the fabric, the annex facade, and the retention of that in a scheme. And there are different ways to do it, whether it's 20 feet or something less than that, which is more as of right. I think we would like to see that. And also the idea of trying to do some kind of setback to allow for more views into the church itself, and maybe retain the sort of three-dimensional quality of the relationship of the buildings that are there right now with your new building. And I think in terms of the height, there's some different opinions here, but I think it's worthwhile at least looking at seeing if the height can be brought down, and thinking about the setback, and also if there are ways to adjust the floor-to-ceiling heights to continue to keep your program. Okay? All right. Okay, thank you. And we close the hearing.